Finally, the successor to one of my favourite racing quads has arrived. So you probably remember the original Holybro Kopis 1, an absolutely lovely drone. One of my favourites without question, and one of the main things that stood out for me were the camera, the way it flew straight out of the box, and also just the build quality. There was also the other element, which is flight time. This thing would fly for ages. It had really economical, efficient motors from T-Motor, and that meant you were getting flights of around 5-6 minutes from a 1300 milliamp battery. Well, guess what's arrived? Woo! The Kopis 2. This has arrived to us straight from Holybro. It's the SE model as well, so let's take a look. Now these Holybro quads are always packaged beautifully. We get exactly the same plush carry case as we got with the original Kopis 1, which is really nice actually. I mean, it's not very portable, but it does allow you to transport it with the props on. So if you're just heading to the field, it's nice to be able to take everything with you. And there it is. So it has that kind of very similar Holybro look to it, and we will compare the two in a minute directly, but just before we do, let's take a quick look at what else comes in the package. So we've got in this zip section up here, first of all, a little bag of bits, and in there it looks like we've got a camera programming board, we've got some spare heat shrink, that's probably more for the plug and play version, manual, and some other bits, as well as some spare prop nuts. Now that's great, there's nothing more annoying than losing a prop nut when you're at the field and you can't fly anymore. We've also got some lovely spare props, and these props are the Dal Prop Cyclone. They're the T5046C, so slightly different pitch than the props that were supplied with the Holybro Kopis 1, but beautiful looking props those. We've also got a spare parts manual, which hopefully we won't need. So that's what you get in the box. Let's take a closer look at this beautiful quad. So I've just put the props on to give you an idea of what it looks like. I haven't tightened them up, so yeah, for those of you that spot those tiny little things, you can see that these two quads are quite different, and it is of course an evolution from the Kopis 1. It's a shame actually, or surprising to see that there's no marketing printing on here, so Holybro Kopis 2 as we had on the original model, but still it is a beautiful looking quad, very sleek, and obviously they've gone for the all black look this time, perhaps taking inspiration from the very popular Furibee Dark Max, which is a great quad and one that I actually always compared to the Holybro Kopis 1 as a worthy, cheaper competitor. So as I mentioned, it does have a real premium feel to it, but despite that, this quad weighs 300 grams. That's with the props, but without a battery, obviously. So still very lightweight, like the original Kopis 1 as well. The carbon fibre plates here are a combination between 3 and 4 mil, and then the arms are 5 mil. However, this is not solid carbon fibre, and it does look like another material, perhaps fiberglass or something similar, has been used in the centre. Or it could be white carbon fibre, I don't know. But regardless, the arms are nice and lightweight, and I can't see that sacrificing a lot of strength here at all. These arms feel solid. Now, the other lovely thing about the arms is that they are individually replaceable as well. So you can actually, if you break an arm somehow, you can detach it and fit a new arm, and they're of course available as spares, so that's really good as well. Now, the sandwiched material in those arms, you could argue, is Holybro cost saving, but I don't know, I'm not convinced. Is it really cheaper to manufacture an additional material and then sandwich the boards and etc., or just to simply use thicker carbon? I think using thicker carbon might actually be quicker and cheaper. The material cost, of course, is higher, but the process of sandwiching the material like that, I think they've done it for lightweightness. I'm not sure, I'm no expert on materials, but it doesn't bother me. It's still a solid feeling quad. The actual shape of the frame, it's a stretched frame just like the old model, and the size is almost identical. What's quite nice, however, is that they've added these little tip guards here, which is really nice. If you do happen to impact a tree or similar, it's going to save these lovely motors and avoid you damaging those T-motors. Then we've got the main central section here. Now that's much longer than the previous Kopis 1, and that means it's not so much of a squash to fit all of the components in there. Talking of the components inside this stack, we've got a lovely little arrangement here. It's a Kahoot-driven flight controller again, but this time it's an F7 instead of an F4. Now there's still a bit of hesitation perhaps in the industry to move to F7 as a standard, but it does give you faster processing, and it's perhaps becoming more and more popular as they're becoming more stable. So that's really good. It does also permit you a 32 kilohertz PID loop time, which is quite impressive as well. So yeah, lightning fast flight controller in the middle. There's also, of course, your VTX in there, which is an ATL HVV2 VTX with switchable output and more channels than you would ever need access to. On the side is also a tiny little USB port, and then of course the little UFL connector for the VTX, so quite nice that that's pluggable. On the other side of the flight controller stack, you've got a little button there for probably the VTX settings, and then there is this downward connector. Now I've said it on other videos, I'm really not a fan of these side exiting power supply cables. I don't know, they just don't work for me. I prefer it to be exiting from the rear and then looping around to the battery, which is mounted underneath. But it's a method that more and more manufacturers seem to be using, so maybe it's just me missing the point, but I'm really not a fan. But they are lovely, thick, high gauge power cables with an XT60 connector on the side. And talking of batteries, this one is spec'd for up to a 6S. So on a 6S, this thing's really gonna scream. I'll probably be flying it on a 4S. You wouldn't wanna put anything less on this realistically. Now the previous Kopis 1 had its speed controllers underneath the arms, and I really didn't like that, because where do you think they're going to get damaged? Well, underneath the arms, probably on landing or during a crash. So they've now moved to an all-in-one speed controller, which is centrally mounted within that stack. It's also a 35 amp speed controller, which is a gain over the previous 30 amp. In addition, because of the flight controller being an F7 and the all-in-one speed controller, you can run D-Shot 1200. The all-in-one speed controller then of course routes along these arms to these beautiful T motors on the ends. These are the F40 Pro 2. They're 2400 kV, which is slightly less than the kV of the Kopis 1, which were 2450s. But of course, they're probably making up for that in the slight pitch change on the props. But I can't wait to see how the power of these compares to the previous Kopis 1, because that thing had tons of power. Also on the rear of the Kopis 2 is a little fox ear antenna. Could be a mini pagoda, I'm not sure, but that has a slight downward tilt on it as well, so that when you're flying, it has nice orientation in the air. Now I've got the bind and fly version here, so it comes with an FR Sky receiver. It's a diversity receiver, which is great to see as well. On the cheaper RTF quads, you generally rarely see a diversity receiver these days, unfortunately, but you can see the antennas routed out the side and attached to the arms in that style. So that's quite nice. No changes needed there. They're hopefully not going to move into the path of the props, so good to see that we don't need to tweak anything before we can fly it. Also, whilst we're looking at the rear, you'll notice there are no LEDs on this one as there were on the previous Kopis 1, but there is luckily still a buzzer, which is oddly sticking out of the side down here. No issue, normally you see them poking out the rear, and that one does feel a little bit of an afterthought, but it's got a buzzer, so I'm happy. Now there is a rather interesting change to the Kopis 2, and if I just bring in the Kopis 1, I'm sure that you'll probably immediately spot it. So you'll notice that on the Kopis 1 we've got this lovely big run cam here, whereas on the Kopis 2 we've got a mini run cam. So this is the Run Cam Swift Micro. Interesting that they went with a micro cam, but I guess they're confident that the quality of this is as good as this one. Now if you look at the difference between these lenses, it's significantly different. So I really just hope that this tiny little lens is going to give us as good performance and a beautiful picture. If not, then I will be swapping the camera right out. However, another thing that's worth noting is the difference in protection. One of the issues I didn't like about the Kopis 1 is just how much that camera lens and the camera itself actually protruded outside the frame. So if you were to hit a tree or something, that camera was going to get smashed up. Whereas with the Kopis 2, that camera is tucked right inside that frame and totally protected. So really good to see. The camera does also tilt nicely as well, and it tilts all the way up to almost 90 degrees. So if you are a crazy, insane FPVer, it's going to cater for your preferences there. So all in all, a really beautifully constructed quad. Great build quality, lovely quality components, and lightweight as well. The downside of this is probably the price. If we look at Banggood at the moment, it's retailing for about £250. GearBest have it up for £280, and it does vary elsewhere as well. So this is not cheap, but then this is not a bulk produced quad that's ready to fly, such as the Furibee range, where you're going to have to change things before you can fly it. If this is anything like the Kopis 1, then right out of the box it flew beautifully, had tons of power, and was really crash resistant as well. So I think the next step is the flight test, and that's what we're going to do next.